So we've been looking at Richard Bauckham's book, and the last two videos have been basically playing devil's advocate, coming across and critiquing his book, a book that, generally speaking, most of it, not all of it, I agree with. So we played devil's advocate, specifically on the Papyrus scholarship. So that's where we're at. Basically, the last two videos could be summed up when Gary Habermas was debating Anthony Flew on the resurrection of Christ. Anthony Flew stated that he was an atheist at the time, became a deist later, but he stated that the resurrection is believable if it's in the context of the God of the Old Testament. And that's the point. I think that facts without a context don't get you completely to believe in Christ, in the sense that I can lay all the historical facts about Jesus, him dying and rising again, but if someone doesn't believe there's a God, they're not going to end up believing Jesus as the Son of God and rising from the dead. So you have to give evidence and facts about Jesus and his life, and this stuff by Bauckham is really helpful for that. But at the same time, you need to present evidence or some thoughts or some ideas about who God is, and that why the resurrection would have taken place in the context of the God of the Bible. I think that can't be left out. I think that's important. So I think presuppositional apologetics would be helpful at this point to bring in if you were debating or discussing. Okay, let's carry on with the book. We've got a few more videos to make. I hope this study anyway introduces you to Bauckham, and introduces you and encourages you in your faith and challenges you as a skeptic. Some of it might be a bit too heavy for you. This is advanced studies on the topic, so you'll have to read the book or go over the videos again. Bauckham writes, the form critics did not think much of the information which the ancient church provides concerning the concrete persons behind the Gospels, not even of the personal references in the New Testament. The notion of a creative community makes questions of concrete traditions uninteresting. This depersonalization has had a contagious effect right into the present. It still regularly happens that people literally speak of products of the church. That's Jimmy Dealey Dungan, and of traditions which circulated in the communities, instead of asking who has formulated or transmitted a certain text. Page 93. So this is really, really important, because a lot of scholars, modern scholars, and this has been going on for over 150 years, have actually been telling the public that they are historians looking at the ancient texts and looking at what the ancient writers are saying. But actually what happens is they come with a theory, and the theory has gone something like this. It's come in different forms. It might be Renan, it might be Strauss, it might be a Bultmann, it might be any number of these critical scholars over 150 years, and it comes down to this. Basically, the church and what the church said is irrelevant. We're going to find the original Jesus, therefore we will look at the original Jesus, and one of our theories is XYZ. So in this particular case, our theory is that there were communities who developed the oral tradition. Now the problem with that kind of thinking, and led to great problems, is Number one, it disparaged the church's evidence, i.e. the early church fathers, and secondly, it was not historically hermeneutical. It was not rooted in the studies of the way things actually were in the first century. And what Bauckham has shown is that it was not just these anonymous communities that did oral tradition, but that there were actually individuals who were authoritative, who supervised the passing on of the information about Jesus, and that those who collected that information were acting as not in oral tradition but oral historians, which is a different way of writing, a way of thinking. That's where we're at. And it had a disastrous effect. Rudolf Bultmann, the form critic, ruled the roost in the 1960s virtually unchallenged, but yet his basic principles, one of them, this idea of anonymous communities, lacked no historical verification for such a methodology. So what you've got to be careful of is when you have these academics who attack the Christian faith, such as Richard Carrier or Dr. Price or Bart Ehrman, and they say that they're using objective criteria, they say that they're coming at it from a historian's point of view, you better double check whether that's the case. You better double check whether they're actually looking in the historical context of the time in a fair, honest way. For example, I have checked the quotes by Richard Carrier of ancient text, and he's always misquoting them. I have checked the scholarship of Dr. Price concerning Mithraism and how that has affected Christianity, and it has no evidence whatsoever. I have checked various scholars about Ehrman's comments about the way the lack of literacy and the problems that had on the spread of the copying text of the Gospels. I have checked these things and found that they do not actually correspond to the reality of the historical times that they're talking about. It's incumbent upon you, as a skeptic and as a Christian, not just to listen to the scholars, but to do your own research and to find out for yourself. How many times have I heard atheists tell me that Jesus was a myth? And yet when I call them out on it and ask them, well, where is your evidence? They don't have any evidence. And those atheists or those skeptics who said that Jesus exists will hint that Jesus was perhaps influenced, came out of the idea of Jesus came out of Mithraism, and I have checked all the scholarship on this over 1,000 years of history on Mithraism, from 500 BC to 600 AD, checked all the scholarly information that I could find on primary source historical material, and found that the skeptics, found that the atheists who insinuate this have not got any evidence to substantiate what they're saying. Page 95. That Jesus himself appointed 12 of his disciples for a special place in his mission of renewing and restoring God's people, Israel, has been doubted by some scholars following the lead of Rudolf Bultmann, who have supposed that the notion of the 12 originated only later. However, a large majority of recent scholars has accepted it, especially since it coheres so well with the trend to understand Jesus as thoroughly Jewish terms. Page 95. So you can see a massive seesaw going on in the history of historical scholarship concerning Jesus studies. At the time of Bultmann, it was stated that this idea that Jesus had 12 main disciples is just pure myth. But then, when the scholars began to ditch the Bauckham ideas and the form criticism, and began to look at first century Judaism in the context of, I kid you not, first century Judaism. In other words, scholars realized that the Bauckham project of the 1960s and the form criticism that went on and on and on about don't look at anything from a Jewish context because that's not true to the context. Let's see what the Greek context is of the gospel literature, and that's the real authentic gospel literature. But scholars realized that this was just not true, that if we actually look at first century Judaism, surely we need to consider that it was Jewish, that there was a Jewishness about this literature, that there were Jewish aspects to this literature, that there was reflections of the Gospels of Jewish culture, that it weren't just all Greek influenced. And that made them realize that actually the word 12 disciples was not Greek, it was something to do with the fact that the early disciples, early first century Judaism, had these kinds of rabbis and teachers that would do this. And so therefore it became historically viable to say that Jesus had 12 disciples. A complete seesaw in the scholarship. What that tells you as a Christian is beware of any scholar that comes to you, or when you go to university and the scholar is accepted ultimately by the academic world in historical Jesus studies. It doesn't mean diddly squat if you go to the evidence and the evidence completely disagrees with what the major scholars are saying. Do your own research and make sure that what you base your teaching on, your ideas about Jesus, is based on good, fair, honest, open study of the evidence. And if you did that as a skeptic, you would become a Christian, because you would see that your skepticism is not warranted if you were objective and fair in the studying of the evidence.